Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 121st video in our Master Series and the 7th video in our group processing. I hopefully made the last video about equalization as simple as possible and to help you understand that for the most part, hopefully, it's to sweeten your mix and kind of clean up the equalization. And any major work would be done on the individual tracks and buses, that 3 steps forward, 1 step back, and evaluating things. So I hope I made that pretty clear, and let me know if you have any questions. Now, next we're routed into the stereo bus. Now, with the stereo bus, there's a couple things we want to take into consideration. But first of all, always remember, keep that 3 steps forward, 1 step back in your head, so that you always remember that if you're fussing with everything, you change anything, you go back to those individual tracks, individual buses, see if you need to adjustment anywhere in line, come back to here, adjust there, on so on and so forth. And anytime you do any adjusting in any of the buses, you might go back to here, go walk through these again, anything you might need to adjust after you've done any work here, and then forward. Does that make sense? So that is a huge concept to get in your head that seems time consuming, but it can help you do a really good job. Also, that automation, we talked about that once you get a mix done, that it's depending on the complement of instruments inside the mix in different sections, that each section can be its own mix, which means anything you do is automated and done differently on each section, whether it's a verse or a chorus or bridge or whatever, so that each section gets the attention it needs and the work done on it that it needs as an individuality in the mix. Next, we also talked about analysis tools. Always remember, I always keep my analysis tools out in the open up in another window or here, so I can keep an eye on things, what's going on, to help me evaluate what I need to do and evaluate what I'm doing. So keep that in mind. So I try to say that before every one of these just to make it, just in case you just watch this video. So basically, when you get into the stereo bus, a couple things to consider. The first thing that we're talking about is normally whenever we're processing here is sweetening the mix. So basically, we're just kind of sweetening things up, just kind of putting the final touches on it. So something like the stereo bus, if you've done everything we talked about so far, most of that work has been done. So, you might not have to worry about it too much, but it's something to take a look at. That way you go look and listen to the stereo field really closely to each individual section to see if it needs work on it. Sometimes it will. Sometimes you might use the stereo bus to get out a stereo enhancing tool to really widen the stereo field. You might, for the chorus or the bridge or the lead or something, you might put a lot on it just for that section or something like that. Just adding stereo field to widen it up and fatten it up and just sound like a whoosh, yeah, dude. And that's cool. You might not want to do that for the whole production. You might just use it as an effect in certain areas, or in a break or a transition or something like that. So keep that in mind. It's a pretty simple concept of just checking it. Get in there and you're going to add some in there, A-B it back and forth, walk away, come back, and things like that. You want to do it 2 or 3 times. You're coming into it, that sounds like a lot, back off a little bit, A-B it on and off, whatever you're doing whenever you're dealing with a stereo field like that. It's a pretty simple concept. Normally, widening the stereo field, the plugins normally work pretty simply, and there's lots of them, so you really have to experiment with which one's doing a better job as far as you're concerned. Would be difficult to say. But most of them that you can buy will do a pretty good job. So, that's the first concept, and that's not a hard concept. Also, keep in mind that anytime you see that happening, you might want to go back to those individual buses and do some work on them first, or the individual tracks or something like that, before, because you don't want to add a whole lot in here. You might not want to do a whole lot. You might want to just widen it for the vocals or the guitar or something, in there that you don't want to widen everything, because then it starts causing some muddiness. And that because not only does the stereo field plugins widen the stereo field, but they also start moving things out. So what happens is it causes a type of a blending effect, which can also have a detrimental effect of muddying the mix a little bit. So you really have to keep that in mind. but it's a pretty simple concept. And most of the time, I mean, there's sometimes I'll put it on a whole mix, but most of the time it's some section that could really use, a really wide, fat sound, and so I'll really widen the stereo field on that one section or in the chorus or the hook of the song or something, and it's just going along, and all of a sudden, ba bam bam, da 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 da, something going on like that, and then back, with it off, and so automation is going to come into play there. So it's a pretty simple concept. Another use of this tool is great because the other use of this tool, just like when we did saturation and when we go to do our sweetening up with our, our placement of the mix, meaning, where it's at, putting it in its place. We've got that open air and we've got that analog delay that we've got on all those buses that's going to, so everything sounds like it's in the same location, that most of the time it's a sweetening of it that just kind of blends things together and melds things together and kind of glues the mix together. Well, this can also do the same thing in light amounts using a stereo enhancer, being that it starts pushing things out in the stereo field, going light with it. Even on a whole mix, sometimes it can do this blending melding effect that does it a little bit differently by pushing things out in the stereo field that causes them to start to push into each other's stereo field, set place that you've put them in the stereo field by, getting things in their place. And it starts to push them into each other a little bit and causes a little bit of a blending effect that can really kind of smooth out any rough edges on the mix and make it sound more, blended and melded together and glued together. And that is a concept that you really need to experiment with, and you really need to walk away, come back and listen, A/B it off and on and things like that to really hear the effect. Sometimes you got to bring it in a little bit more to hear it a little bit heavy and back off a little bit. A/B it backing off, bring it up again, bring it down, bring it back up again. And you start to A/B it back and forth to really hear that effect, because it really will. It will do the same. It'll do that blending, melding, gluing effect a little bit differently by moving things in the stereo field a little bit. It might, if you were using it for that effect, which I do whenever I go to a stereo field bus, it's one of the biggest reasons why I even have one on there, because it just adds a little bit of blending and melding to where, it's not a lot, but you'll hear it kind of spread the stereo field a little bit, and you might hear a little bit of stereo widening happening, but not much. And what you're really looking for is that blending melding effect that just kind of pushes things into other things' space a little bit. Not much, but just a little bit, that kind of smooths out the composition and smooths out the rough edges of it that, causes that blended, melded, glued in effect. And so it's a huge concept to get in your head and to practice with. Teaching you that, the best way to teach you is to explain the concept to you and then have you get in with a mix and start experimenting with it, because you really have to hear what it does to understand the concept and go, oh yeah, I hear it widening it a little bit, but it's kind of gluing together, melding it, kind of mellowing it out, adding, it's starting to, that concept of what that is really is something auditory that you really need to hear to understand the effect that it's having. But that it is having an effect, and now that you know that it does and can be a very useful tool, will cause you to go experiment with it and use it. So it's a pretty simple concept. It's not that hard, widening the stereo field. Be real careful of widening the stereo field a lot, because it can have a kind of a reverse effect of sounding not normal. It starts pushing everything out in the stereo field, and it just doesn't sound good. If you're having problems and you're trying to get wide stereo field, you may end up being better off going back to those original buses or those original tracks in their buses and trying to widen there, with some stereo widening effects or processing techniques that we talked about when we were going through, working on those tracks and buses, so that you lessen the amount of that melding blending effect by putting a lot here on this bus that can cause a detrimental effect of mudding and reducing clarity. And also sometimes that you're widening stuff in the mix that you don't want to, where you'd be just like, well, it would be really cool if just the guys in the chorus were wider. So I'm dealing with the stereo field. So during the chorus, I'm going back to that bus that those guys are on the harmonies, and I'm going to put that plug in there to try to widen that, or rework the work I've done on them a little bit to make them sound better. So because here it's just sweetening. Does that make sense? So it's a pretty simple concept. Oh, I'm on a stereo field bus. It's a pretty simple concept that, to look at it that way and to understand it's a very useful tool. Now, there's plenty of tools on the market that will do that, and I'm not recommending anyone. I use the isotope tools a lot because I love my isotope tools. I just do. And, there's other tools like binaural pan. Binaural tools can have the same effect. If you're dealing with a stereo field and two speakers or two headphones, that binaural effects can have some effect on the stereo field. It's very unique to where when you're dealing with the stereo field and you start trying to widen the stereo field and you start trying to widen with binaural effects, it does it a little bit differently. And sometimes even a combination of them both can have a really cool effect of what's going on, which takes experimentation. It's just like, I've got this compressor and this hardware compressor that, combined add this real nice saturation that I like, you know what I'm saying? Or this analog desk mixed with this compressor, it adds this type of saturation that sounds really cool. It's the same kind of concept. They'll do it a little bit differently. But the binaural pans, you experiment with them, and binaural effects can have a really cool effect in widening the stereo field a little bit differently, because it's trying to do it a little bit differently, but it's trying to sum it into stereo field. So it's going to affect it not in the way it was designed, but, and it's still going to be attempting to do that, which is going to have effect on the stereo field. So it's really great to experiment, and sometimes a combination of both of them can have some really cool effects that you're trying to you've got a stereo field, you've got a little bit added in there, and you're like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And you add some binaural pan in there also, or some binaural effect, widening a little bit of that, and a combination that might get the sound that you're looking for. And it's like, whoa, yeah, that sounds really cool. So it's an experiment. There's all kinds of plugins that can widen the stereo field. This plugin is from Sennheiser. That's a really wild one for putting things in their place, which is, I didn't get any of that stuff because that's a little bit abstract, trying to get a good mix done, and that stuff gets a little complicated and become a part of your workflow. And, and most of them haven't come out that are that good yet that I recommend them. So it's a pretty simple concept. But if you can get that in your head whenever you get to the stereo bus and your stereo field bus, and try to approach it that way and try to do a workflow, something like that, to try to work through it, you should be able to come out with something pretty good. Just always remember, go light. You can always add more later. As you go through all this, go a little light. And you get to the end and you've done your limiting and you're ready to do a mix down, reevaluate. I'll go through that and I'll go light and I'll go back through everything. Now can I add more? Or not, or less, or what? Because, once I've done all this, I may go back and go, well, now, I can add more of that and I can do more of that, or I can do less of that, or something like that in different sections, which seems time consuming, but that's basically, the better you get and the more productions you do, the faster that'll happen, because it'll be more natural, like brushing your teeth. You don't have to go through a checklist to brush your teeth. You do it so much. But, even when you become a good engineer, that, it can get kind of complicated. And some of the things we talk about are kind of complicated. And not only are they complicated, it's hard to teach them because you have to hear them. You have to experiment them with yourself. And then not only do you have to be able to hear them and be able to detect them, and then it's a taste thing. Your personal preference of whether you like that or not, and somebody else's preference might be different, or they might like to do it different. And that all becomes from experimentation on your part with this step, so that you become comfortable with using it in the way that appeals to you and the way that you want to do production. So that's always a given. So I hope that made the stereo bus and working on the stereo field and a couple different things that are involved there and ways that can be used, made that very clear. and that you can get your stereo bus done with your stereo field. Do a good job on that before we go on to working on our mid and sides. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on working on our stereo field and the stereo bus, and I'll see you in the next video.